Welcome to Teaching Truth. For over 2 decades, a defiant, cocky man by the name of Napoleon created turmoil in Europe. Despite his small stature, just over 5 feet, he caused great trouble for all the people around him. In a bid to regain some of the power he had lost due to a forced exile, he led his armies in a swathe of devastation across the battlefields of Europe. On June the 18th, 1815, Napoleon and his armies faced the allied armies of England, Prussia, Russia, Austria, Belgium, and the Netherlands, led no less by the Duke of Wellington. Before the battle commenced, Napoleon, speaking to his commanding officers, said, "We will put the infantry here, the cavalry over there, and the artillery in that spot. At the end of the day, England will be at the feet of France, and Wellington will be the prisoner of Napoleon." The officer responded, "But Napoleon, we must not forget that man proposes, and it is God who disposes." And yet, with his typical arrogance, Napoleon stood as straight and as tall as his 5-foot frame would allow, and replied with these words, "I want you to understand, sir, that Napoleon proposes and Napoleon disposes." Victor Hugo, the writer, penned these words concerning the Battle of Waterloo. "From that moment, Waterloo was lost, for God sent rain and hail so that the troops of Napoleon could not maneuver as he had planned. And on the night of the battle, it was Napoleon who was prisoner of Wellington, and France who was at the feet of England." Pride goes before a fall. That was so true of Napoleon, a small man, an arrogant man, and a proud man. Napoleon had, as it were, climbed the ladder. He was at the top of the board, and all of a sudden he was brought down to earth on that slithery snake, as it were, back to square one. That reminds me of the game that I'm sure we've all played of snakes and ladders. And snakes and ladders is the interesting theme for our reflections this week as we think of Nebuchadnezzar's downfall from Daniel chapter 4. When we've played snakes and ladders, we've probably got to square 97 on the board. We've thrown a 2 on the dice, and all of a sudden it takes us to square 99, where there's a snake that brings us right back down to square 2. We think we're doing so well in the game. We can become so proud and so arrogant, and yet very quickly we're brought back down to the bottom of the board. That's what happened to Napoleon, and that's what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Pride, as the saying goes before a fall. Nebuchadnezzar was enjoying a time of peace and security. After defeating all his enemies and completing several impressive building projects, Nebuchadnezzar was at last able to rest at home and delight in what he had accomplished. Nebuchadnezzar thought that he was the builder of Babylon the Great and the architect of its peace and prosperity. But he was soon to learn, as we will discover in our reflections this week, that all of these things had been permitted by the will of the Most High God. God had, in effect, allowed Nebuchadnezzar to progress up the snakes and ladders board to square 97. But very soon Nebuchadnezzar was to throw the dice, and all of a sudden he was to come back down on that slithery snake back to earth. If you have your Bible, I invite you to turn, if you will, to Daniel chapter 4. And we're going to read just a selection of verses from this to show how Nebuchadnezzar had reached, as it were, the top of the snakes and ladders board, how he had climbed the ladder, but also how he then slithered, as it were, back down the snake. Daniel chapter 4, verse 1. To the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar was at square 97 on the snakes and ladders board. However, turn to verse 33, when the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had is fulfilled. And all of a sudden we see him sliding down the slithery snake. Immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. Nebuchadnezzar had climbed the ladder, but God in his plan and his purpose brought him back down to earth, back as it were, to square one. Once again, God in his plan and in his grace used a dream to communicate to Nebuchadnezzar an important message. And what was an important message? Well, in his first dream in Daniel 2, the king saw a great metallic image of which he was the head of gold. But in this dream, as we read in Daniel 4, he saw a huge flourishing tree that fed and sheltered a host of animals and birds. He heard an angel command that the tree be chopped down, its branches and leaves cut off, its roots scattered, and its stump bandied with iron and bronze. After this second dream, he, that is Nebuchadnezzar, was terrified. He summoned his wise men and asked them for the interpretation of the dream, but again they were baffled, and so Daniel was called. The king described his dream to Daniel, the vastness of the tree, the terrifying words of the angel, and the dream was sent to Nebuchadnezzar to teach him an important lesson. What is that important lesson? Well, verse 17, the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men, and he gives them to anyone he wishes and sets them over the lowliest of men. The king's dream, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, was sent to bring him down to earth. The king, oh yes, Nebuchadnezzar could issue his decrees, and he issued many, but it was the decrees from the throne of heaven that ruled the events on earth. Pride goes before a fall, and Nebuchadnezzar discovered that. He, as it were, had climbed a ladder to the top of the snakes and ladders board. He threw the dice, and all of a sudden he finds himself back down at square one. The lesson for us today is to beware that pride goes before a fall, and to remember that God is sovereign and we should honour and be humble before him.